We've been on Rexton since 1998. The second property, Rainmore, we've had for 6 years. When we started here, it was very conventional. It had been overgrazed, severely overgrazed, and there was quite a lot of marginal country that was being farmed. Yeah, it was quite degraded, a lot of bare ground. Small falls of rain, 2 inches of rain, would end up with a lot of water in melon holes, a lot of water running off.
There was grass, but it wasn't a desirable species, I suppose is what you call it now. Monoculture, bare earth, it was, it just lacked energy.
What happens over time, if you leave stock left in the paddock, they'd basically grazed out a lot of the desirable species over time, so we're left with a lot of lower successional, undesirable grasses.
We knew the undesirables, and we had that mindset at that time that we needed to get rid of the roly-poly. The only way to get rid of the roly-poly...
I sprayed it with chemicals.
Tom would spray it, or he'd plough it up and try and then encourage, thinking that we would bring back a more desirable species. But that didn't happen. It came back.
When it turned dry, pastures lacked resilience. Our carrying capacity dropped quite quickly, and so we actually fed quite a lot in those days, supplement or substitute fed to continue the business. Turning our rainfall into grass was very poor. We lost most of our water in runoff, and what did grow was low successional, so our productivity per hectare was considerably lower. Obviously our dream at that time was to be more profitable and to have this farm in a lot better ecological state. Discomfort brings change, and we weren't comfortable with what we were seeing and what we were experiencing, so that was when we looked to become educated in how we could change that. And our dream was certainly a lot more diversity of pasture, a lot more ground cover, and a lot more productive cattle. Ultimately, a profitable business, where we're not here if it's not a profitable business. Part of our dream is always to potentially have an opportunity for our kids if they're so inclined. It's not an impost on them, but if they're interested, then it would be nice to be able to give them a future in what we do if they're interested in it.
And I suppose coming from that, succession is a big threat to our business. So we realised that fairly early in the piece, having been through succession with probably my family and Tom's family, and we wanted to do it differently.
Succession is a major threat to any business, but it's a particularly major threat to an agricultural business. I guess the discomfort with where we were led to, seeking solutions for how we could change. And I did a weekend course with holistic management, and then found out about RCS and progressed to a 7-day Grazing for Profit school. Which
at that time you thought was very expensive. And you thought, and wondering what you were going to get out of it.
Yeah, I guess I looked at it as a cost rather than value at the time, and I know that now that was a very valuable thing that we did.
Tom still quotes when he first did his Grazing for Profit school, at the beginning of the course, he's sitting there like a lot of people do, with his arms folded and wondering what this is all about and when are we going to get to the stuff that he really wanted to hear. By about the 4th day, Tom's arms would have been unfolded and he's starting to sit forward and take notice and take notes, etc. And by the time we get to the 7th day, he's enthused and he's ready to walk out and have a go at a new world. Well, rotational grazing itself's been around since the late 1600s, and there's evidence of it right through until, over several hundred years. But the thing we're doing here is time control grazing, which is different from rotational grazing. So rotational grazing is calendar-based, moving animals based on a piece of paper hanging on a wall. So we move them once a week, every month or 3 months or whatever it is. Time control grazing is based on moving the animals around what the plants are doing and what the soil's doing and what the ecosystem's doing. That was only developed in about the 1940s, 1950s in France. And that's when it really started, the time-controlled grazing stuff. And so we've shifted away from rotational grazing into time-controlled grazing, and the outcomes are quite different. What you can do with an environment, what you can do with animals, etc. The time-controlled grazing, the fundamental principle of it is resting a plant to give it adequate rest. And that rest is determined by the growth rate of the plant. So when the plant is growing fast, then it needs a short rest period. When it's growing very slowly or we're in a drought, then it needs a long rest period. And that's essentially the basis of it. There's a number of principles. The first principle is planning, monitoring and managing. So that's what Tom and Antoinette are talking about here, using grazing charts, using those tools. That's where you plan, you monitor and you manage. The second principle is about rest and getting the rest right for the plant. And the third principle, which is just as important, is matching stocking rate to carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is how much feed grows up from the ground, and stocking rate is how many animals you put on top of it. And those two things are vertically opposed. And this is the most difficult principle to get right, because you know how many stock you've always got, but you don't know what's going to happen to your carrying capacity. And rain can change that, a fire can change that, locusts can change that carrying capacity very quickly. And then you've got to respond with the number of animals that you've got to match the stocking rate to carrying capacity. And the fourth principle is about the animals themselves. We want good animal performance, because if we don't have good animal performance, then we're not going to get good gross margins and good profitability out of the business. And one of the really key things in time-controlled grazing, which you've seen here on this farm, is how you move the livestock. It's really critical that they're moved in the right way, and they're calm, they understand what they're doing, and they move through in a very slow way and put their heads down and graze. And that's about animal performance. And then there's things like density and biodiversity, which are also critical to us. Well, when you see those symptoms of bare ground and so on, and you look for a solution to that, then time-controlled grazing is a perfect solution. And we're using the animals to actually heal the country. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand, is that we can use the animals as a tool, and their impact on the soil, their impact on the plants, the fact that we can release the pressure on the plants, release the pressure on the soil by controlling where the animals are and how they actually graze and move. All of those things then start to heal those issues that we found with the land right in the beginning.
We design our rest period on what we believe our desirable species require to recover. And so at certain times of the year that may only be 30 to 40 days, and at some times of the year it could be 120 days. So as we work from the ground up, from the plant, and then we adapt our mob size and our speed of movement on what we believe that desirable species requires. And the thing about that is we're focusing on the species that we want, the desirable ones. And in doing that, you have to ignore, particularly in the beginning, less desirable species, because they're there, because they've survived right through the set grazing system or overgrazing system. But gradually, the desirables come back, and in the end, they are the dominant. As we are in the position we're in now, our desirable species are by far dominant.
And they've been waiting there. Those seeds have been there for 40, 50 years, waiting for an opportunity.
Yeah, we've got Mitchell grass in big areas now, and some older people in the district can't remember seeing it. So it was waiting for a long time just for some rest and the right conditions to come back. In order to implement that, we had to improve our water system. So we had quite a capital expenditure on water and then fencing. And I suppose, once we believed we had a solution, we got stuck in and implemented it. One of the major challenges of that, I guess, is the psychology of us learning to do that.
I remember Tom, we had 200 cattle in one cell for the first time in the middle of summer. And I think you went to the paddock
Well, it was
6
actually
times, like to check.
I don't want to correct on
Water.
TV, but it was actually 70 heifers, and I was there 5 times in the day, worried that I'd be overgrazing that paddock. So, and now we can put 600 or 800 in that same paddock. So it's an education process. It takes time.
Yep.
Yeah. The labour component is obviously during the development. We use contractors mainly for most of the fencing and putting the water in. Yeah, and a big part of this is the psychology of the stock, the livestock. They have to really be well adapted to the moving, and we use what we call low-stress stock handling principles. So when we first started in this process, I guess originally, and I mentioned before, spraying out woody weeds with chemical, and part of this journey was to learn to focus on the species that we desired. My background was focused on what we didn't want, and so as we've changed that, and we now focus on what we want, and we learn to ignore some of the undesirable species and weeds, and ultimately a lot of them they reduce in number anyway. Some of the other tools we've implemented to assist in the journey, we've started with grazing charts with RCS, but we've since gone to My Grazing. It's an electronic, an app-based grazing chart, and that's really good because whoever moves the mob moves the livestock on their phone, so there's no reason for it not to be up to date. We also use a stock book, which is a individual animal software for weight recording and NLIS data. So,
Which has definitely made it easier to analyse and,
yeah, it does. I guess if you're not measuring it, you can't see the change, and that took a little while to sink in. We probably didn't do enough measuring in the beginning, but yeah, we've learned that if you measure, you know you can record change and see progress.
The first principle is planning, monitoring, and then reacting to what you see. So the planning is around feed budgeting, for example. So get out in the paddock, look at how much feed is there. When animals go into a paddock or just before they go in, you estimate the feed. When they come out, you estimate the feed again, because the thing you know for sure is how much they took out. You then record that on a grazing chart, so you know how many days were spent in a paddock, when they were there, how much rest that paddock has got, and you can see all that on a grazing chart. And so you've got a budget, and you've got a demand, or a supply and a demand, and then you match those two up. And then the grazing chart also helps you monitor that and look forward. So on a grazing chart, we can be looking 4 to 6 months in advance and say, well, what if it rains? What if it doesn't rain? What are we going to look like in 4 to 6 months' time? And that's a very powerful planning tool.
Well, we had quite a lot of confidence in the change by the time we bought Rainmore. We've recorded, been more thorough in our record keeping at Rainmore. But no doubt, say in the last 5 or 6 years that we've had Rainmore, 2 of those years were the driest in 100 years in this area. And what was quite noticeable was the productivity gap between the 2 properties in that dry time. So the resilience in the country that we've grazed for longer in this way, yeah, it outperformed the newer country quite considerably. We use a system, stock days per hectare per 100 mils, and for relativity that was about 8, and this property was 23 to 25. So given that, this property would have started around about 7 or 8. I guess the reality is if you build in rest, you don't get it perfect all the time. If you build in rest, you can't really get it that wrong. It's like your lawn at home where you're mowing and you're trying to just take the top off and let it regrow, and you keep it really enthusiastic and keep it healthy and the root system growing, and we're trying to do that with our desirable species. Yeah, but not every species is ready for grazing at the same time. Animals like certain species at certain times of the year. But generally speaking, we go into the paddock and we look at what the animals are eating at the time, and we adjust our rest period for that plant. It doesn't really matter if there's one beside it they're not eating, because it's not being affected. But we certainly are watching what the animals are eating at the time and governing our rest period and therefore our speed of movement back to that plant, or those plants. Yeah. Well, I guess one of the main things we've seen, and whether that's soil, it's ground cover as well, but our water utilisation's much better. So as I said back in the beginning, if 2 inches of rain, we'd have water running everywhere into melon holes. Now that same effect would take 4 or 5 inches of rain. Due to the feed budgeting and matching our stocking rate to carrying capacity, we go more gradually into a dry time, but more importantly, we recover quite well coming out of it. So it creates opportunities for trading.
Lowers the blood pressure.
Yeah, it lowers the blood pressure. While our carrying capacity has improved from, say, 8 stock days per hectare to mid-20s, what has happened more so is we've ironed out the deep troughs. So we're more consistent. And because of the resilience in our pastures, where we don't have the great highs and great lows, and we found that is good for business. Because the last thing we need to be doing if we've got a cattle trade in progress is cutting that short and making it uneconomical. So,
return on infrastructure really is the way to look at a time-controlled grazing system. Our data over a long period of time shows that generally you'll get about a 30% return on that. We often aim for 100% return. So if we set a high target, we're going to achieve a really good target. And around that 30%. I think consistently, but it does depend on season. So if you spend the money on that infrastructure and go straight into a 3-year drought, well, you can forget about making your return on that money immediately. Although I have seen it just by having the water infrastructure in place. But generally, if the seasons go with you, you'll pay that back in 3 to 5 years, which is, in today's terms, pretty damn good return on investment. When you've got the foundations like you've got here, so you've got the pastures working, your soil's starting to work, and biodiversity increasing in your landscape, it opens up opportunities for other income streams.
Yeah, I guess when I first went jackarooing, it was all about the animal. So we focused on how the animal looked and the condition of the animal. And then after a while, it became evident that relied on the pasture. But probably in the last 10 to 15 years, really begun to realise that it's actually all soil health. So a healthy soil drives the pasture, which drives the healthy animal and the productive animal. So yeah, we really now are, I guess we're carbon farmers or we're soil farmers. We're actually looking to maximise the soil biology and the health of our soil, because the rest of our business will flow on from there.